Thank you. My name is Jean Fisher, and I'm the State Director for Right on Crime. I also come before you as a 33-year veteran deputy prosecutor from Ada County, and in my experience had worked with probably some of the highest victim impact cases that we've had in child abuse and sexual assault. I'm not here to talk about the fentanyl issue and the mandatory minimum portion of this bill. I'm only here to talk about the drug-induced homicide, which I think is really flawed. I think it's very bad policy. And I think that you are going to get caught up in user-to-user criminal prosecutions. We have heard about this bill in other states. I can tell you, having done some research now, that there are 25 other states that have this bill, or have this law. 23 of those states have Good Samaritan laws included. Nevada actually includes that you can be prosecuted if you don't attempt to save the life of someone. 5 states require that someone knew that the drug contained fentanyl. 7 states require exceptions to juvenile crimes. These are all over the board. Under the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys Strategies for Prosecuting These Cases, they acknowledge that these state statutes offered very broadly, that they can be ranged from manslaughter to first-degree murder, and that over 50% of all of these cases involve the prosecution of families with their friends and families and user-to-user. This is not about getting traffickers. This is a user-to-user problem, and this is what this is going to ensnare. I have a legal disagreement with Senator Lakey about the juvenile issue. I do think that juveniles get opted out. This is a form of homicide. It is a form of murder. Manslaughter is a form of murder. That also would be opted out. I think it's a legal argument that we will have to address. But I am very concerned about the nature of this particular bill and how it focuses its attention on users and not traffickers. And that's who we're going to ensnare. And that seems really like bad policy to me and not particularly pretty politics either. My time's expired.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Any questions, Senator? Got your name, Windrow.
Windrow, you forgot my name. That's okay, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Fisher, I mean, it's hard not to call you deputy prosecutor anymore. I've known you so long in that role. Would you be willing to, I know you were kind of rushing through there, and so you kind of glossed over the concerns with the legal disagreement. Could you, I mean, I just need to really understand this, the argument about the homicide, murder, et cetera. Again, because I think a lot of people, everyone, all of us in this room can agree we care about kids. And I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying there a little bit better.
Ms. Fisher?
Chairman or Senator Foreman, at the risk of this turning into a law school exam in question, I will do my best. But there are some issues about this that obviously may be new law. But right now, Idaho does have murder, and murder is defined by 4 different acts of murder. There's first degree, second degree, manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, and then you have vehicular, which I'm not really focusing on. Of that, murder is the unlawful taking of another person. Of that, you then have different degrees of murder. Manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, is the deliberate criminal act which results in the unintended death of another person, which is exactly what this user-to-user drug-induced homicide is. I'm participating in an illegal act. I know that I am using drugs, and I'm going to a party, and I'm going to give it to my buddy, and we're both going to participate in an illegal act. I'm not intending my buddy to die. In fact, I'm hoping tomorrow we're going to get up and we're going to laugh about it. But I don't know what else my buddy has on board. And I didn't know it had fentanyl, and my buddy dies. So it's the exact equivalent of manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. And we already have that on the books. And law enforcement already has the opportunity to use involuntary manslaughter to prove that case if it were necessary. The problem with the drug-induced homicide is that it really is focused just at drug users and traffickers. Anybody could potentially fall under a murder, but only drug users are going to fall under this. And it begs the question about, is this really what we are wanting to happen with our youth and young adults who make a very stupid mistake of using the drug and passing it and someone else's dies, and then you are now on criminally for essentially taking the life of another person, which is murder. I mean, let's not get too in our heads about this. That's what it is. And so I think that we already have that statute on the books without having to pinpoint to drug users for this particular crime. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Thank you.
Senator Ruckty, question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Fisher. So under the drug-induced homicide statute, I don't practice criminal law, so I still struggle with how to read this a little bit. But again, it references, let's see, the person has violated the provisions of section 37-2732A, and then you go to 37-2732A, and it says, if they have, let's see, it's unlawful for any person to manufacture or deliver. And I don't see any intent language there, so it reads to me like you could, at a party, hand some drugs to your buddy, not even know it's been laced, and yet still get charged under this. And I was hoping you could just clarify whether that's an accurate reading.
Ms. Fisher?
Chairman, Senator, that is exactly my view of this, is that you don't have to have intent. You don't have to know that what you passed off was fentanyl. In fact, this law doesn't require it to have fentanyl at all. This law, proposed law, says that if you give any drug that's prescribed under 37-2732, and it results in the death of somebody else, you could be charged. So cocaine, cocaine's been around a long time. There's a lot of cocaine users out there. And people who use cocaine are not dying at some rate that is causing a public outcry. Because if there were, we'd have a much bigger problem. We know that cocaine use is a relatively common among drugs. People who snort cocaine aren't expecting to die from this, right? They're just, I got some cocaine, I'm gonna give it to my buddy, but I didn't know that the cocaine I had was laced with fentanyl, and my body dies. So there's no intent in any of the passing that off other than the intent to use the illegal drug. That's what this targets.
Any further questions? Senator Hart?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Fisher, I forgot, were you a public defender or prosecutor?
As a prosecutor.
Prosecutor. We've gone through a couple of scenarios here about people at a party that are knowingly using drugs, but what if they're not at a party, and what if there's some substance that has drugs in it, a Schedule I drug, and one person gives it to another and they die? We're not talking about a culture of drug use, we're just talking about any other set of life circumstances. Would that person could they be prosecuted under this drug-induced homicide?
Ms. Fisher?
Chairman, or Senator Foreman, Senator Hart, there's always going to be an investigation in these cases, right? I mean, law enforcement clearly is going to have to come in and investigate and come up to that level of probable cause to determine whether or not a crime was committed. And if somebody was so unknowingly emptied out, got some Ambien from online from Mexico, rather than going through their local pharmacy, you can get Ambien from Mexico, and they get some from Mexico, and your friend says, yeah, I really am not sleeping, and you haven't tried it yet, and you give it to your buddy who you're helping to think you're going to go sleep, and it has fentanyl and they die. It would be a hard criminal prosecution. It would be a very, very difficult criminal prosecution if it was just that straight and just that narrow. I'm sure that somebody would want to know about that, but I don't know that, that would necessarily fall under the question that you're asking here today in that scenario. So, I mean, it's always illegal to, give your prescription drugs to somebody else, but that's not what really what we're talking about. And in that scenario, it would be hard for me to imagine a prosecution in that level. So I don't see it in the same way.
Thank you. Follow-up question?
Follow-up, Senator?
Ms. Fisher, do you see any constitutional defects in this Section 3 of the bill in the drug-induced homicide?
Ms. Fisher?
Senator Foreman, Senator Hart, I am not a constitutional law expert in the field. I look at this bill, though, So I don't know that I see a constitutional issue because we can have proximate cause issues, I suppose, for these sorts of deaths. I see it more, what I see it more of a problem is this. In the conversations that I have had, even with some of the law enforcement officers I've talked to, even one prosecutor that I talked to, when I asked, why do we want this drug-induced homicide? Why? It's not drafted well. Causation is nearly impossible. I mean, how are you going to know that my last pass-off was the cause of your death when you have other things on board? And routinely, they have all said, yeah, we're never going to use this bill, and causation is really hard to prove. So if we already know that, and we already know it's so difficult, and it has no opt-out and no good Samaritan, then why do we want this? Because it doesn't have anything to do with the mandatory minimum on the fentanyl, which is what I thought this was really aimed at. That's not what this is. This is kind of an add-on. And why, with all the public attention that this bill is getting, why do we want to tell parents, grieving loved ones who have lost somebody, when they show up at the prosecutor's office and they say, someone has to pay, and I want you to charge drug-induced homicide for my loved one? Why do we want the prosecutor to look at him and say, you know, we can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no way to prove it. We can't prove what the last drug was. This was poorly written legislation. And everybody here already knows it. And so do a lot of people sitting in this room. But for whatever reason, it's got a driving force. And I think it gives parents a false sense. And it's a terrible thing to do, to be in a situation, to have that grieving parent come to you, begging for you to do something as a prosecutor when you know that you can't or you won't. And they already know that right now. And so do most of you. So I urge you to just either fix this portion, because it's fixable. It's very fixable. Or opt it out, because you have your fentanyl. You can pass the mandatory minimum on fentanyl. You have involuntary manslaughter. If that's what we really want, use the tool that we have. But this is not drafted like other states. This one includes any drug, any delivery. It's without sideboards. No good Samaritan. Nothing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Senator Wintrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And really quickly, Ms. Fisher, thanks for that. I really appreciate your passion. I know I know this is probably hard for you. I guess I just want to be clear, what you're saying is, based on how prosecutors and other law enforcement agents build cases, it sounds like what you're saying, we already have laws on the books. If we wanted to build a case where somebody was intentionally harming somebody or passing drugs along, et cetera, that we already have those laws, and this really is not necessary.
Ms. Fisher?
Senator Foreman, Senator Wintrow, thank you. That's exactly right. We already have on the books involuntary manslaughter. If we thought that somebody was purposefully passing off fentanyl drugs, you have first degree, you have second degree murder. That is murder with deliberate malice aforethought. You have that in front of you. You don't need the drug-induced homicide to just muddy this up.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your testimony. And we will move